days. It's a brutal business. It's toxic, polarisation. The hours are relentless. The lobbying, the hard work, the humiliations, all of that. And my view about hard work is the same as Ronald Reagan's. It's true that hard work never killed anybody, but I figure why take the chance? I'm here today to talk about foreign policy, actually. It's about how a libertarian or a non-interventionist should approach the world. Now, admittedly, this is a complicated subject because folks on the broad right of the political and ideological spectrum have different views about foreign policy. But before I explain what I think Australia should do in the world, let me just debunk what I see as three myths that reflect the elite's attitudes towards public affairs, or at least foreign policy. The first myth is that we are living in the most uncertain, unpredictable, volatile times in living memory. And you'll often hear this. If you read the government's white paper that was released a few months ago, you'll see the words unprecedented, unpredictable, volatile, littered all across the report. And it is true, of course, that with the rise of China and Donald Trump's rise and Brexit, Islamic terror, problems in the Middle East, the digital evolution of the global economy, they are very unsettling times for people who do follow international affairs. But is this really more volatile and unpredictable than, say, the late 40s or throughout the 1950s, the early to mid stages of the Cold War, when we in Australia had to deal with the end of empire, the rise of decolonisation, the rise of Asian nationalism, and of course communism? Is it really so unpredictable and volatile as that period? Are we living in more unpredictable and uncertain times as the late 60s, when the British withdrew its naval force from east of Suez, or when President Richard Nixon went to Guam, famously declaring the end of American guarantees, security guarantees to its allies? That led to a sense of widespread disillusionment in Canberra. Is it more unsettling than, say, the end of the Cold War in the late 80s and early 1990s, when we were told it was the end of history? When Gareth Evans, who was the foreign minister at the time, said recently about that period, that was the most volatile and unpredictable period in international relations. I mean, you'll often hear this. The era we're living in now, is it more unpredictable and volatile than, say, the aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks in New York, Pennsylvania, and Washington? I don't think so. I think you should bear all that in mind when you hear people say we're living in the most uncertain period in international relations in living memory. The other myth you'll often hear is that we in Australia don't have an independent foreign policy, that we're lickspittles of what Robert Menzies called our great and powerful friends. And again, it's true that from 1901, when we became an independent state, right through to the 40s and 50s, we did hitch our security to Great Britain, the mother country, and of course, since the onset of the Cold War in the 50s, it's been the United States. But that does not mean Australia has been a lickspittle of our great and powerful friends. Just think how this country expressed its independence within and sometimes without the empire in the first decades of the 20th century. The distinguished diplomatic historian Neville Maney has documented in great detail how our leaders clashed with their counterparts in Whitehall when they felt that Australia's distinctive interests clashed with the mother country. Have we forgotten about Menzies' decision to delay sending Australian troops to the Middle East at the outbreak of World War II? Have we forgotten about Gough Whitlam's ministers in the early 1970s? As soon as Gough was elected in late 1972, Jim Cairns, Tom Uren, Clyde Cameron, they all said that Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger were fascists and madmen and murderers for the bombing of Hanoi. That didn't seem like someone who were towing the American line. What about Bob Hawke's decision to withdraw from our participation in the MX missiles in the 1980s? Again, there's lots of examples that indicate that Australia has often taken issue with our great and powerful friends. Now, in recent times, we've had a lot of former diplomats like Bruce Grant and Alison Bronowski. They'll all too often say that since the Howard era, we have been lickspittles of the Americans. But just look at Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott went to great lengths, despite the Obama administration's lobbying, to support our inclusion in the China-led Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank. Look at Malcolm Turnbull. Despite all the lobbying from the Pentagon over the last 3 or so years, Australia has refrained from doing our own freedom of navigation patrols through that contentious area in the South China Sea. So bear all that in mind when you hear people say we have no independent foreign policy. The third and final myth I want to just puncture before I talk about what I think we should do is this notion that China's rise means that America is going to be displaced as the main regional power or hegemon in the Asia-Pacific region. Now, one can't deny that China has emerged on the global stage, and as its strategic interests change, as its power increases, it's more likely that China would like to assert a sphere of influence in what it sees as its backyard. It's also true that US credibility and prestige and influence have waned somewhat since what I think was the disastrous decision to invade Iraq in 2003. Having said all that, across most of Asia, there remains a well-founded conviction that the US will remain the predominant power in defence, innovation, energy self-sufficiency, education. Demographic trends are working crucially in America's favour because of higher fertility rates and immigration levels. Whereas China will grow old before it grows rich, and even if Beijing can sort out its demographic problems, other problems loom on the horizon. Economic, environmental, among other things. Bear all this in mind when you hear confident predictions from the likes of Hugh White at ANU that China is on the cusp of replacing America and Australia should hop on the China bandwagon. You'll often hear this in Canberra. That doesn't deny that US strategic dominance in Asia may be narrowing, and it doesn't deny, as I said before, that China is clearly more assertive today than at any time since its loss in the Opium Wars in the mid-19th century. It just means that our policymakers and political leaders will need to navigate this emerging terrain and play a more demanding diplomatic game than ever before, one that on occasion means that we should ride 2 horses simultaneously. That is the United States on the one hand and China on the other. All that's true, but to suggest we're living in the most volatile and unpredictable times in living memory since the 1940s, or that we don't have an independent foreign policy, or that the Americans are about to displace, is fanciful in my judgment. So what kind of foreign policy then should we pursue as libertarians, conservatives and liberals? The first point I'd make is to dispense with this language that we should somehow be hawkish. You'll often hear this among my conservative and liberal and libertarian friends, that we should be hawkish in the world. But this is a phrase I think that raises very serious questions. My friend Owen Harries, a distinguished conservative realist intellectual, he has argued that to declare oneself a hawk in general without any context to specify what one is being hawkish about is, well, silly. It's to substitute a posture of indiscriminate toughness for serious thought. What do my friends mean when they say they want to be hawkish on Indonesia? What precisely does it mean to be a hawk concerning the future of Asia? Support for the quadrilateral strategic ties with Japan, India and Washington? Or a ruthless determination to keep out of harm's way in the South and East China Seas? How does hawkishness translate into a policy in the Middle East? Does it mean ground troops in Iraq and Syria, heavy bombing, or a resolute turning away? Some of my mates also refer to themselves as cheap hawks. Cheap hawks. But again, that phrase raises all sorts of questions, not least the basic question of ends and means. To desire the end without being prepared to provide the means is one of the deadly sins of foreign policy. When political figures speak in these terms, it's clear they haven't seriously thought about what they're saying. Many of you are no doubt familiar with the great American novelist F. Scott Fitzgerald, who said that the definition of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold 2 opposed ideas at the same time and function normally. I think that's exactly right about many of the people who describe themselves as a cheap hawk. To advocate two dramatically opposed and incompatible policies at the same time is merely the evidence of first-rate confusion. Walter Lippmann, who was admittedly on the sort of soft left of the American political spectrum throughout much of the Cold War, he was a leading critic of America's Cold War policies in Asia. He makes the point that a disjunction between ambition and resources, that is, the attempt to sustain greatness on the cheap, is highly dangerous in terms of a nation's lives, treasure and blood. Moreover, an intrusive foreign policy is fundamentally incompatible with libertarian and conservative calls to reduce the size of the government. Such a foreign policy requires and creates a strong government with sweeping powers. Besides, hawkishness leads occasionally to war, which more than anything else has traditionally enlarged the sphere of the central government. And even if war never breaks out, allowing for its possibility and providing the resources necessary to pursue a hawkish foreign policy invariably enhances the power of the state. My own view is that foreign policy realism, with its emphasis on the balance of power, spheres of influence, recognition of limits, reconciling ends and means, that is the appropriate foreign policy, more or less, for a libertarian and a non-interventionist. The second point I'd make before we go to questions is I think we should just ditch this idea, and again you're hearing this a lot in Canberra in the Trump era, not from the high-level policymakers but from intellectuals and strategists on the sideline, that we have a choice between China and America. Now my own view is that this country is still the epitome of a satisfied status quo state. We're a well-endowed middle power with a modest population enjoying an enviable share of the world's wealth and advantages. We have every reason to assume that any radical change in the existing state of the region's economic and strategic affairs will diminish rather than enhance our position. That means, for what it's worth, I think Canberra should focus more on regional issues and not global issues. And we should insist that neither Washington nor Beijing upset the delicate regional equilibrium that has kept the peace in our region for so long. In other words, we should stay on the American bandwagon, but not sign up to every American initiative. For instance, and this is a very unpopular view in my conservative circles friends, but I think that the lesson of the last 15 years shows that we should be very sceptical about getting involved in these misbegotten ventures in the Middle East. Just look at Iraq. Our invasion in 2003 was the greatest strategic blunder in living memory. I would argue even worse than Vietnam. It was unnecessary because the threat that the Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein posed could have been contained and deterred the way it had been since the previous Gulf War in 1991. Saddam, for example, knew that if he smuggled weapons of mass destruction to Islamic jihadists or even used them against American interests in the region, it would guarantee massive retaliation, probably annihilation. He wanted to survive. And as we now know, he didn't even have those weapons. Yet for many neoconservatives and liberal hawks, the realist strategy of containment has somehow become a discredited policy. In the case of Iraq during the Saddam era, it meant cuddling a suicidal tyrant. Never mind that containment, the sanctions regime, no-fly zone, the naval blockade, all these things kept Saddam in a box. And for all the political sex appeal of liberation at the time, at least containment recognised the dangers of unintended consequences that a liberated Iraq has now delivered. Iran and its Shia militias acquired new influence within Iraq and of course the broader region, while parts of Iraq fell into the hands of those Sunni jihadists who are even more fanatical than Al-Qaeda, the perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks. Moreover, as I mentioned before, Iraq cost the United States dearly in prestige and credibility and influence. The lesson here is that Containment can't work against jihadists. Jihadists can run and hide. But rogue states are different. They have a mailing address. And if they ever use weapons of mass destruction, they'd be annihilated. And keep that in mind when we're talking about the threat posed by the North Korean dictatorship of Kim Jong-un. He is not, contrary to the conventional wisdom, crazy. His primary goal is survival. He knows that the end of his regime means the end of Kim. From his perspective, it makes sense to develop nuclear weapons because they're the ultimate deterrent to a foreign attack. North Korea is placed in a very troublesome neighbourhood. It's surrounded by three major powers: China, Russia, Japan, and of course the United States, which all too often threatens it with regime change. When Washington tries to strike at Bashar al-Assad in Syria, as President Trump did about a year ago, or when the Americans bring down Saddam in Iraq or Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, that provides a powerful incentive for the North Koreans to have nuclear weapons. The cold hard reality is that there is no viable military option against these bastards. They have nuclear weapons, which they can respond with. They have formidable military conventional artillery, which they can use to hit Seoul. A preventive strike by the Americans may provoke the very action it's designed to prevent. As Bismarck once warned, it's like committing suicide from the death of fear. As unfashionable as it is to say so in Canberra and in Washington, a political settlement with Pyongyang is probably not ideal, but it's the best alternative. We have no choice in the meantime to contain and deter North Korea, as we more or less have for the last 20 or so years since Pyongyang developed the nuclear capacities. At the same time, we should reconcile our support for the US alliance with our rapidly developing trade relationship with China. In recent years, Canberra has taken several positions that tilt in China's favour, from joining the China-run Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, which I mentioned, to leasing the Darwin port to a Chinese company, to failing to follow up America's freedom of navigation patrols through the South China Sea. All of this might indicate that the US can't rely on Canberra for unqualified support in any Sino-American crisis. On the other hand, the Australian government is increasingly more sceptical, and I would say rightly so, sceptical of the communist regime in Beijing. In 2016, we rejected a Chinese bid to buy our largest electricity network. Earlier last year, we thwarted Beijing plans to establish a link between investment in the Northern Territory and the Belt and Road Initiative. And of course, doubts are intensifying about China's increasingly interventionist positions in our domestic politics. Moreover, polls show that although Australians shy away from President Trump, there is nevertheless large support for the US alliance. So we're not faced with a hard, stark choice between China and America. But returning to my earlier point, our political leaders will need to learn to play a more demanding diplomatic game than ever before, one that on occasion will require doing the difficult feat of riding two horses simultaneously. And this means that instead of the straightforward virtue of unconditional loyalty that more or less has served Australia until recently, will need to become increasingly more ambiguous, discriminatory and qualified in our commitments. Now, in devising this worldview and the appropriate Australian foreign policy suited to it, I hope it's one that resonates with any good libertarian, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you very much.
Bear with me while I try and work this out. It's not like I don't spend half my life around microphones.
While doing that, one of the things that strikes me is that Hugh White, Paul Keating, Bob Carr will all too often say that President Trump wants to lead an American retreat from East Asia. But on the other hand, these are the same people who are fretting and wailing that Donald Trump wants to contain China. You can't be both, and it gets back to my point about F. Scott Fitzgerald's definition of a first-rate intelligence.
So I believe the microphone's working now, so we'll take a few questions. My name's Peter Brown. Tom, hello, can you hear now? Would you be prepared to join the Liberal Party and challenge Malcolm Turnbull for pre-selection of the seat of Wentworth?
Well, I said I don't want to go into politics because it's hard work.
I think we could refrain from encouraging people to join other parties.
That's a great line. I don't think that the Liberal Party pre-selectors would have me in Wentworth. I think you've got to be of a certain ilk.
Somebody's got to stand up against it.
I'll take one from here, and then we've got one up the back and another couple down here. So, just talking to the top of it.
Hi, Tom.
The top, not the side.
Oh, okay. Probably a few of us do belong to the CIS and the IPA come to that, as well as this political party. And your move to CIS is quite interesting. You have a very different style from your predecessor. I'm just wondering, do you have any changes in mind for the organisation?
Well, look, the first point I make is that my predecessor, Greg Lindsay, ran the show for more than 4 decades, and you know, he is an ornament in many respects to public policy, because if you go back to the mid to late 1970s, it was a very barren time in Australian public policy. There weren't many people who believed in reducing the size and the scope of the federal government, to prosecute the case for sound economic reform which would create wealth and prosperity. And he set up the CIS at a time when Keynesianism was very popular. And over time, he helped, along with good institutions like the IPA, change that intellectual mindset. And I would argue that the CIS, during that period especially, played an instrumental role in changing the public policy landscape in Canberra. We've had 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth, and I think in large part it's because of the economic reforms, the free market reform by and large, that were put in place by Hawke, Keating, Howard and Costello. Now, unfortunately, over the last 10 years, politicians on both sides have gone off the rail, particularly the Labor Party, and I think that's why we need a counter-argument now more than ever. And I'm very happy to join forces with groups like the IPA in the public policy think tank landscape to try to change the culture. But it's not just economics, it's also culture. You know, it's just disheartening when you see the left use GetUp to prosecute their twisted views on a wide variety of cultural issues. Whatever one's view is on same-sex marriage, I thought it was absolutely outrageous that these groups, this social media lynch mob, would target board members for holding a traditional view on marriage. I mean, we live in a liberal democracy. People should be free to speak out as they see fit, not be worried about being intimidated by a bunch of social media lynch mobs. So this is what we're up against now. It is a cultural war, but more importantly, and just as importantly, it's the economic case now for reducing the size and the scope of the government, which has increased dramatically in the last 10 years.
So we'll take 2 more questions, and I'm sure Tom will hang around for a while so people can bash his ear a bit more later on.
Graham Nichols. Graham Nichols. Obviously, we're going to have a lot more diplomatic action in your scenario. Could you comment on the difference between having professional diplomats and ex-politicians as diplomats?
Well, there's no hard and set rules here. You'll get some politicians who are out of their depth in diplomacy, and then some diplomats who are out of their depth in diplomacy. So there's no set rules. All parties have jobs for the boys, is the expression I think you're thinking of, have used this mindset. I think, you know, the next generation, people who are in their 40s and 30s who are coming through, will start to look more sceptically about some of the things that have dominated the public policy landscape in Canberra. I think of a classic case in point being joining up to these United Nations treaties. You know, there's a mindset in Canberra on both sides that this is a good thing for the national interest. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. You know, one of my other jobs, believe it or not, is at the ABC, Radio National. And when President Trump decided to withdraw the United States from the Paris Climate Accords last winter, the overwhelming consensus at Auntie was that this should be condemned. So morning, noon and night, on the Friday and the Saturday, after Trump pulled out, it was wall-to-wall coverage slamming Donald Trump's position on pulling out of the Paris Climate Accords. I came to work over the weekend to prepare for my Sunday morning program, which I then hosted. And I said to my producer, look, we need someone to take issue with this prevailing wisdom, just one person. And I asked Nigel Lawson, my good friend, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer to Margaret Thatcher, who's been weighing the good fight on the perils of decarbonising the global economy. I had him lined up, one-on-one, and I was going to ask him some tough questions. Anyone who listens to my show knows that I'm not going to just give you softball questions, there are going to be some tough questions as well. There was an ABC intervention, or a Radio National intervention, that said, oh, you can't just have Nigel Lawson, we need to balance him up with 2 climate enthusiasts. How about you get Tim Flannery and John Hewson to balance him? That's what you're up against. So the point I'm saying is that I think increasingly a lot of younger people, particularly on our side of politics, are sceptical of these international treaties. Because A, they're not legally binding, they're not enforceable, they're not verifiable. And moreover, countries should be allowed to put into place the policies that they took to the election. And that's precisely what Donald Trump did in 2016.
Tom, thanks for your talk to us today.
Chris.
I just wanted to ask you a question on, a lot of the focus was on foreign intervention by means of military and this sort of genre, which is very relevant. But having just read the recent Cato report, which I know is of interest to you, this Human Freedom Index, which is a link between economic freedom and personal freedom, do you think there's a role in foreign policy for nations to encourage freedom, democracy, that kind of, because that's a form of intervention, and I suppose this comes into the foreign aid side of politics. Rather than giving out food parcels, is there a role for a government or a nation encouraging the sorts of liberal freedoms that we would stand for?
Well, certainly if you look at the Cold War, after Castro, for example, came to power in Cuba, the United States imposed an economic blockade on the communist regime. And it was an overwhelmingly popular policy to do. But that economic blockade coincided with Castro's time in office from '59 right through to, 2016. So the embargo itself didn't really work, whereas it's my firm view that if the United States traded with the communists and introduced US foreign investment into Cuba, it would have a multiplier effect and the people would want more freedom. I think free trade ultimately leads to more prosperity and wealth, and as a result that leads to more hankering for freedom. On the other hand, it is complicated because if you look at China, since Deng Xiaoping implemented free market reforms in the early 1980s, although China has become a much more prosperous place than it was under Mao Zedong and the Red Chinese, nevertheless, China's human rights record is still pretty bad. But I would still even argue in the case of China, human rights is a lot better today than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. And that's largely because China is more integrated in the world. So to answer your question, I think that free trade can actually help promote prosperity and ultimately individual freedom. Question of foreign aid is a bit more complicated. I know David Leyonhjelm supports the idea of slashing our foreign aid and then using that revenue to help double our refugee intake, I think our refugee intake is fine where it is, and I actually do support the tough border protection policies in the country because it helps boost public confidence for a good, non-discriminatory immigration policy that's controlled and orderly, whereas you don't see that kind of public faith in immigration in many parts of Europe. I think immigration ultimately is a good thing. So I'm a bit sceptical about completely slashing foreign aid, but then again, I think there should be more scrutiny of foreign aid because all too often a lot of our tax dollars go to these regimes that just prop up the reigning dictator, and that is not in our interest.
And that is, I think, one of the best examples of timekeeping I've ever been party to. So would you please put your hands together, Tom Switzer?